And I am obviously Bruce Pickering. The Asia Society is another nonprofit that's based in New York City that focuses on a wide range of issues. Probably none more important these days than China's development and what it means for the world writ large. Bradley Gardner, to my left, is a research fellow at the Independent Institute as well as a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State. It says you're currently serving in Nepal, but you look like you're here.
Until about until about 2 weeks ago.
Got it. He is prior to joining the Foreign Service, he was the managing editor of China International Business, and he also worked as a research analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit for China. He's also the author of the book that we're going to talk about tonight, China's Great Migration, How the Poor Built a Prosperous Nation. For those of you who are here tonight, please see the program flyer for his full biography. I would note he's local. He grew up in Santa Clara, went to USC, and got his master's at Chicago. So we're going to start with a kind of an exchange between the two of us, and then at some point around a little after 7 o'clock, we'll open it the floor to the audience. So Bradley, this is actually a fascinating topic. It's one that I've actually thought a lot about and been interested in for a long time. In the book, you note that since 1978, from 1978 to 2002, China's cities grew to about over 500 million. And by the way, the numbers that Bradley uses, we talked about this before, are actually conservative, partly because it's peer-reviewed and partly because the scope and scale of China's migration just defies the imagination. It is, in fact, the greatest migration of humans in the history of the planet. It's all internal to China, though, so it's not as if it's been overseas, and Bradley identifies this. And the book, as I took it away, is actually, it's almost a kind of a lever for a broader conversation about how China has gone from a country that had its annual gross domestic product, $400 billion, to now $6 trillion, and from so far below Western industrialized countries that it was hardly measurable to now the second largest economy in the world, and if it continues on its current trajectory, it'll be the largest economy in the world by about 2030 or so, if I'm correct. Maybe sooner the way things are going in Washington right now. But anyway, I digress. In that time, he points out that China's growth has added about $1.1 trillion to the global economy. And much of this is based on a kind of efficiency, so to speak, of China's migrant labor moving from rural China to urban China, and in the process actually fueling China's and sort of serving China's rise as this previously, I guess, inefficiently tapped labor source has turned into now a source of great strength for China. So Bradley, just to start off, what possessed you to write this book? I mean, why did you take this topic on, which is huge?
So I came to China way back when in 2007, and I had previously worked as a financial journalist covering finance and monetary policy in Europe. And when I got to China, I thought I was going to write about the same thing, finance and monetary policy in Europe, and I wanted to, in China, and I wanted to write about, and I wanted to get a sense of kind of why China worked. I was aware of the fact that China was escaping poverty rapidly. I was aware of the fact it was growing rapidly, and I wanted to know what people were doing right there. And then I got there and was horrified by everything I saw. China's financial system it doesn't work very well. It's not at all like the financial systems that we're used to in the West. The number I use in the book is something like 80% of all financial assets go to state-owned enterprises. And then as you dig down more into this, the fiscal system gets even wackier. Something like 30% of all local government assets comes from land seizures. And I was looking at this and I go...
That's an extraordinary total, by the way.
Oh yeah, no, it's again, all the numbers in this book are completely unbelievable and completely true.
And he was modest, right? He understated it.
And so I originally was quite like, this can't be working. And then I kept on moving forward. And so I wanted to come up with a story that can explain how China can systematically redirect money towards state-owned enterprises, systematically steal land from its people, and move 753 million people out of poverty in the course of about 30 to 35 years. And I had been interested in migration issues for a long time. As you mentioned, I grew up in Santa Clara. I grew up in Santa Clara during the first dot-com boom, which added a few people to our region. My parents bought their house in the 1970s for about $70,000. And so I was aware of kind of what migration can do for an area, and I had an interest in it. And the economist Michael Clemens wrote this brilliant essay in 2008 called $1 Trillion Bills on the Sidewalk, which is based on the hilarious economist joke. Two economists are walking down the road, and one of them sees a $1 trillion bill on the sidewalk. And he says, "Hey, look, there's a $1 trillion bill on the sidewalk." And the other economist goes, "Can't be a $1 trillion bill. If it was, someone would have picked it up by now." And he writes this essay about, I gotta laugh. And he writes this essay about how if you look at the gains from, the closest estimates do we have on the gains from migration, they are in the realms of 50 to 150% of global GDP. They are in the realms of trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And as I was going through the numbers, the number that struck me as just beautiful for my introduction was the general consensus in the growth accounting literature about China is just picking people up out of agriculture and moving them to industry added about $1.1 trillion to the Chinese economy over 20 years. So in a very overly simplified way, one of the reasons you can say that China developed as successfully as it did was someone just decided to pick up that $1 trillion bill. And then I, as you mentioned, I use that as a way to kind of look at kind of why, because I wanted to know, is this an after effect of something the Chinese government did, or or a cause of something the Chinese government did? So I use this as a way of looking at the political economy of China. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw a lot of, well, there's, to go on to another story, there's a famous story that George W. Bush uses in his memoirs where he says, he told President Hu Jintao that he was kept awake at night by the thought of another terrorist attack, and asked him what kept him up awake at night. And President Hu Jintao responded, the thought of creating 25 million jobs a year. And the conclusion I come to in the book is we should take him very seriously at that. 25 million jobs, again, is probably a conservative estimate. But the more you look at kind of what was going on in the Chinese government over the course of the 35 years, a lot of their major reforms were specifically in response to what migrants were doing and kind of how they could manage first the influx of migrants and then the influx of private enterprises, which were being overwhelmingly staffed by migrants.
Well, one of the points you make in the book, I think, is that it's almost an accident. It's not accidental. But it's not really a government policy, if I understand it. In fact, one of the points you make is that initially, especially with the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, which is these are the large corporations that many of you know of, it was almost to reinforce those. And then your point is, I think if I remember read it correctly, is that in fact a lot of this happened almost accidentally, and the Chinese government had to learn to adapt to it.
So the one thing that I found when going through this is the original reason why China legalized private enterprise was because of the return of the sent-down youth. There was about 17 million teenagers who were sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution to work on farms. And as soon as the Cultural Revolution was over, they all immediately rushed back to the cities. And China, which had economically more or less failed at that point, didn't know how to employ them, which was guaranteed under Chinese law. So they said, work for yourself. And that was the beginning of private enterprise in China. And then from that point forward...
That's a plan.
Yeah. From that point forward, a lot of things change really rapidly. And you get this general sense of the regulators just kind of rushing to keep up as the state-owned enterprises are being competed into the ground as they have financial problems, as social services are being undercut by migrants, and as they needed places to live.
So if we look at this, could you for a moment, and there'll be two sides of this question. So first of all, what's the upside to this? If you look at it, and I know this is a total softball question, the hardball comes second. But what's the upside of this kind of great migration?
Well, the most obvious upside is money. And I mean, $1.1 trillion is probably a conservative estimate. The estimates I came across when as I was going through the literature was just pulling people out of agriculture and putting them into industry. Probably added, the consensus estimate is about a bit over 20% over 20 years. You add to that things like cluster effects, which is, you're not going to have a Foxconn factory if you don't have 400,000 people to work in a Foxconn factory. If you add that to that, the impact of urban construction, which was at one time thought to be about a third of the overall economy, it ends up becoming this enormous number that if I made into a real estimate, no one would believe me. And one of the real positives of this is a lot of this money goes to the people who are migrating. So instead of, obviously rich people got very rich in China, but it's the fastest alleviation of poverty anywhere in the history of the world, and the largest alleviation of poverty anywhere in the history of the world. And part of it was because people who were previously not allowed to work because of very, very bad government policies were suddenly given this opportunity to work, even on a limited basis, even if it was restricted by the hukou system, even if it was restricted.
You might want to explain the hukou system.
So the hukou system is, in China, everyone gets a residence card based on the place where their mother is born. Back during, from about 1960 to the mid-1980s, you were not allowed to leave the place where your parents were born. That started breaking down. And so this was originally enforced by, sometimes this was enforced by people arresting you, and sometimes this was enforced by a variety of soft restrictions. Housing was distributed based on your hukou. Food was distributed based on your hukou back in the day under Mao. And then as those started to break down, people were more or less willing to ignore the risks associated with leaving and go to the city to look for jobs. But it was literally not until 2003 when a migrant was killed while in police custody that the government finally outlawed police arresting people for migrating. Up until until 2003, if you were a migrant living outside of your place of residency, the police could arrest you and send you back, and often you were blackmailed, beaten, all sorts of various bad things happened. It wasn't until someone was literally killed in custody that that people were allowed to freely migrate. And even today, your hukou designates where you receive social services. So particularly children often are not able to get education where their parents are working, which is a substantial restriction still on migration in China, but it's, the benefits are so enormous that most people have gotten to about to ignoring them.
And one of the points you made in the book was that one of the easiest, well, most important, I shouldn't say easy, but one of the most important reforms for China was at least if not the abolishment, at least the diminution of the hukou system. And you said one of the points you made was that you can't be compared to an administrative reform anywhere else because no other place had this kind of a system to reform, if I understand correctly. So basically, by this simple, not so simple, but this one basic administrative reform, they opened the gates to this massive migration that has continued to impact China today.
Well, it was a factor of a lot of things, and this is one of the things I get to towards the end of the book when I'm talking about kind of the relevance for the rest of the world, is so the hukou system up until 2003, they would allow people to arrest you and send them back, but still tons of people were migrating. It was the expansion of migration happened because of various breakdowns in how they distributed goods. So, one was they used to, back in the 70s, you would get urban dwellers would get a ration card, and rural dwellers would be expected to live off their land. Once that broke down, people could get food in the cities. Used to be all housing was owned by state-owned enterprises and was given to their workers. Once that broke down, you can get places to live in the cities. And so there was a number of small things that broke down that made this expand, and while the hukou, people were no longer able to be arrested in 2003. The real takeoff of the Great Migration was 95 to 2000, which was based on a bunch of tax reforms.
So maybe we've talked about, I think, the benefits to China, the benefits to the individuals a bit. So what's been the downside? What are some of the negative effects of this migration?
Well, migration in China continues to be, I mean, it's a political headache, and it's a popular headache. So when you have migrants going to a place, when you have a lot of migrants going to a place, again, this reflects what we've experienced in the Silicon Valley. Asset prices go up, housing gets more expensive, people complain about access to schools, and the large-scale construction surrounding the migration has not always been efficient, has often not been efficiently done, has taken resources that could otherwise, no, that's not the right way of putting it. But that would I say was to be the big downside, is the impact on asset values. But then you get down to the fact that, I mean, the way that they were keeping people in the country was for a long time just by force, and it wasn't sustainable really at all. And part of the downside has been how the Chinese government has implemented the changes. When they went through their tax reforms that provided a lot of incentives for urbanization, it ended up being one of the things that they did, and this was partially by accident, is a lot of local government revenues, as I previously mentioned, about 30% of local government revenues come from land seizures. The way this works is rural land, the price of rural land is set by a multiple of agricultural costs, and the price of urban land is set by the market. And the only way to switch rural land from urban land under Chinese law is for the government to do it. So the government buys up some rural land, which they have very specific procedures to follow, which are never actually followed. And then they sell it to developers, and then that gets into their coffers. They're so dependent on this that they care more about taking the land than they do about kind of using the land properly. The more land that they can take, the better off the government coffers are, and that has been wildly inefficient for them, and has led to more pollution, less density than would be valuable.
Probably a lot of unrest, too, a lot of social unrest, I assume.
A ton of it. Yeah, I would say, I mean, while we like to talk about democracy here, the one thing I would say that Chinese people care most about as far as social unrest is this land seizure problem.
Well, and I think one of the issues you have in a country like China, I think there's a fundamental issue that I think kind of built in, and this gets into a rather systemic discussion, but one of the things I was struck by was, in China, the government is involved in almost every aspect of your life, either directly or indirectly. And that's true of most industrialized countries, but more true, I think, in China than most. One of the things that occurred to me was you kind of owned it all. So one of the issues in a democracy is you kind of know that at the end of the day, the system will change, and there's a built-in mechanism for it. I mean, we're testing the limits of it right now, I wouldn't lie. But nonetheless, the point is that you know that you'll have a chance to weigh in. In China, it's much more guided. It's much more dependent upon, I think, the consent, kind of implied consent of the governed. And one of the issues that I think for the Chinese government in this, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, is they've got to get it right, or at least they've got to get it kind of right, because if they don't, the systemic change is going to be much more dramatic than it would be in a country like the United States. So my question to you is, they've unleashed a tremendous amount of this creative and kind of economic force. But they always have to be aware, the Chinese government always has to be aware of how to manage that. And how have they done that? How have they managed to guide it in a way that's been beneficial to the country and kept the genie of social unrest kind of in the bottle?
My general impression is very poorly.
So I didn't expect that answer, actually.
Well, the Chinese government, I mean, again, the hukou system is a way for them to manage the number of people that flood into the cities. And that has been moderately effective on that front. The first government urbanization plan that has ever come out, it came out in 2014, though it's driven the Chinese economy for years and years and years. This is the first time the government actually made a specific statement on kind of what they want urbanization to kind of look like over the next 10 years. And what they said was concerning. Essentially what they said is we want to move people away from Beijing and Shanghai because there's just too many people in Beijing and Shanghai, and move them to these kind of second tier, third tier, fourth tier cities where people are fleeing from. And in part that is understandable. Beijing, for instance, has very poor water supplies and it's environmentally strained. But it goes back to, I mean, when you look at, I go through the history of kind of how they started pushing people out to the countryside in the 1950s, and one thing they said was Shanghai never, ever, ever can support more than 3 million people, which, you know, looking back on it now, looks crazy.
That would be quaint.
That'd be
That's like a neighborhood in Shanghai nowadays.
So there's very real concern that now that they're trying to redirect people to these internal cities by developing these cities, creating more housing, trying to push industries to go to these cities. There's very real concern that what that's going to turn into is empty housing blocks and state-subsidized industries and things that aren't really good for the country.
Well, and one of the points that I think you made in the book was that it's straining the infrastructure of these cities, too, to have this migration coming. And I'm curious if you could describe, one of the things I'm fascinated about, I actually don't know the answer to this at all. So this is really kind of I'm genuinely curious about it, is what's the system for assigning people? And you do give some illustrative stories of that. What's the system for taking a village and moving people into, as I understand it, the Chinese government has tried to keep the same villagers in the same basic area. When they move them into a part of the city, they try and keep them at least somewhat connected. But what's the process for that? And how do they move them and then actually prepare for their arrival, provide social services? It must be a rather atomizing thing to find yourself in a small town a Chinese small town is 50,000 people or something. But I mean, to go from that to a city like Shanghai or Beijing or Wuhan or something.
Again, it's not very well organized. So in the book, I go through, I visited a small town in Zhengzhou, and Zhengzhou is a ginormous town. But so Zhengzhou, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they got the iPhone factory. So all of you guys' iPhones is made in Zhengzhou, and that's as of about 6 years ago. They had been trying to make Zhengzhou an industrial center for decades before that. It's in the center of the country. It is the source of most of the migrant workers in the country now. It is still the largest rural population in the country, and so they thought, let's keep all these migrant workers in Zhengzhou and turn it into this kind of major hub. They built 2 high-speed rails through it. They built a bunch of highways, and then they recently started building, or they have built, the largest airport in all of China, or that it's competing to be the largest airport in all of China. And then when Foxconn moved in and started making iPhones there, then suddenly you had this flood of people moving there. And so they kept on, in order to manage this kind of flood of people, they kept on taking things from the land from the rural areas on the outskirts of the city and turning it into urban areas. And so in the book, I talk about visiting one of these villages that had been turned into an urban area. And the process was they posted a note on the wall saying they had to get out of the village by a certain date. And if they get out by a certain date, they get, it was about $3,000. And they can use that, and there's an apartment set up for them on the other side of town. They can use that to set up their new apartment. If they don't leave by that time, then they will get no money and be forced to move to that other place. Most of them ended up, now the way this was supposed to work was they were supposed to hold a vote, and if 2/3 of the people voted to sell their land for the amount of money they were giving, then they could move to this place. That wasn't how it happened. And then what ended up happening was, so they had a democratically elected kind of city village council that sold the lands underneath them. And by democratically elected, I mean it was elected after 10 people were cut off the ballot list. And
That's one way to do it.
and then they sold it out from underneath them, disappeared. These people, most of them ended up giving up their homes and taking their money elsewhere. One guy said as a condition of his divorce, his wife got the home and he had no place to live anymore. And there was one lady who was refusing to leave and was locked up in her house with her kid and was throwing, she had a thing of gasoline next to her, and there was when I got there, there was a black circle on the ground where she had thrown a Molotov cocktail at the people coming to get her.
Wow.
She wouldn't talk to me because I was the press, and there was consequences to talking to the press, not throwing Molotov cocktails. But so again, the answer is they deal with it poorly. Sometimes it happens better than other times, depending on how well their government, how well the locally elected people are representing them, or how good the government happens to be in that particular location. But it can be extremely disruptive. What's happening a lot of times, though, is most of these migrants aren't the people who are villages that are wholesale relocated. They're people from the countryside who have decided that, I mean, they originally go to be to do short-term work and then eventually just stay.
So, last question, and then I'll open to the floor. We're getting towards the end of this cycle. I think it's clear. What happens next? I mean, once you've kind of gone through this, the cities are built. There's some degree of equanimity that settles over it. What's the plan?
So this is kind of something that I think the way, so there's, in China, there's these mythical, in the China analyst community, there's these mythical beasts called China bears and China bulls. And when China bears talk about China, they talk about how the financial system doesn't work very well and the fiscal system doesn't work very well and the government's getting more and more into debt. And that's a problem. The best way I had the China bull argument described to me is the way China grows is not through, in the developed worlds, we're used to thinking of growth as the efficient utilization of assets. We use assets efficiently, we develop technology efficiently. The way China grows is not through efficiency, it grows through throwing more assets at a problem. In the words of Wenzhou, if you multiply a problem by the number of China's people, it becomes a really big problem. If you divide it by the number of Chinese people, it becomes a very small problem. So
It's a good line, actually. I like that.
So they just keep on throwing. So if you throw more assets into the economy can keep on growing and growing and growing and growing. Once you can no longer throw more assets into the economy, then efficient growth becomes much more important. And making use of your assets properly becomes much more important. And the China bears aren't wrong in saying that the financial system is on shaky footing and the fiscal system is crazy. But they, when you're growing at 10% a year, you can misuse your assets. When you're growing at 2% a year, it's a bit harder. They still have some time to kind of make changes that might help them grow like a normal developed economy, but the biggest one I would see would be reforming and privatizing their state-owned enterprises, and they've shown no interest in doing that whatsoever.
And why is that?
Why have they shown no interest, or why is that the biggest?
Both. I mean, why is it? I mean, the SOEs, I mean, if you look at the performance of the Chinese economy, the private sector is just way outperforming the SOEs at this point.
It seems to be part of kind of the government's deeply held beliefs in China that the state should have an active role in the economy, and that active role in the economy should be through ownership shares and not through regulation. I'm not entirely certain why they've stuck to that one tenet of communism and not other tenets of communism, but it's as the government's fiscal problems have gotten worse and worse since the 2008 stimulus boom, there's been a lot of talk about reforming these, but they've always fallen short. And it could be because they're politically entrenched or institutions, or it could be anyone who goes to China can see that they don't really have much of a control over what's going on. And with SOEs, they have good control over what's going on. And with regulations, they're much less able to kind of enforce their wills.
Right. So I'm going to turn to the audience questions now, and if you have questions, just fill out one of these blue cards. Do you see relaxation of the one-child policy positively affecting the economic power of the cities, or do you see it leading to an increased competition for jobs in the cities?
Before I answer that question, I forgot to put my disclaimer at the beginning of my talk. As part of my clearance, I have to say that I did this all in my private capacity, and none of this reflects necessarily reflects the views of the United States government.
Right, mine don't reflect the views of the Age Society either, so got it.
Right. The fun thing with the one China policy is no matter what happens in the next 5-10 years, it's going to take 20 to 30 years for it to matter. The early data seems to indicate that Chinese people have started to like only having one child, and population growth birth rates hasn't seemed to pick up that much yet. If they do pick up, again, it will take 20 to 30 years before it starts mattering. The standard estimate is the Great Migration is going to end more or less in the mid-2020s, and we're going to start seeing a shortage of workers by that time. Any additional growth in the birth rate will help ease that problem. It's going to take 20 to 30 years before it becomes a substantive change.
Carl from Oakland asks, will it take a major economic crisis for China's government to reform and de-subsidize its state-owned enterprises? So kind of a follow-on question for this. It's sluggish financial cartels. Who has the strongest incentives to fix things sooner rather than later?
So there was a major financial crisis in the late 90s, and this just goes to show how screwy some of the Chinese financial incentives are. Is that they're close to bailing out their banks again after only 20 years after bailing out their banks the last time. I would assume that a major financial crisis would lead to changes, at least will lead to paring down the problems that they have right now. Hopefully it doesn't get that far. I've spoken to bankers, Western bankers, who have said that they expect China to privatize its entire financial industry in the next 5 years, which I think was a few years ago. So hopefully any time now. And then I've spoken to Chinese bankers who said it's just never going to happen. The Chinese government needs to feels that this need to have control over their financial system is important to whatever it is they're trying to do. I think they're on very shaky footing, and I think particularly as growth slows down, that shaky footing is going to get more shaky.
Miguel asks, what percentage of the credit for China's development can be attributed to businesses from Taiwan, ROC, bringing their money and business acumen to China and using their trading experience with the world?
Probably a good amount. As much as I would like to say the Great Migration is everything, it's not the only reason for China's growth. The big ones this is usually put next to kind of a replication of the Japanese development model, where they bring in export competitiveness and they bring in a lot of kind of encouragement for developing these industrial businesses. To this day, Taiwanese and Hong Kong businesses make up something to like 40% of total export companies or total foreign trade in the country. So it's a big deal, and it probably the fact that China is more open to trade than a lot of other developing countries has probably been very helpful in helping it technologically develop. I couldn't put a number on it though.
Anshud asks, the increase in private enterprise and migration sounds a lot like Soviet-era Gorbachev reforms. How have they kept China from, how has the Chinese leadership kept the country from having the same fate as the disruption of the USSR and the fate of the USSR when it fragmented?
I'm not So I don't know enough about that scenario to talk very intelligently about it. I know one thing that China has that has helped it be more stable is it has a very kind of systematized bureaucracy, and it's managed to do a peaceful transition of power for the past 30 or some odd years, or since 1989 at least. And it remains to be seen how that's going to work when Xi Jinping gets to his 10-year mark. But the fact that things seem to be working in China, I think, is helpful. The fact that there's a kind of distance between the middle class, which are politically active, and the lower class, and the kind of large rural masses that are just kind of looking to get a good job. That and it's a I don't know if I can speak more intelligently than that.
Well, they have. I mean, you talked a little bit about it earlier. I mean, and I think there's sort of the answer kind of flowed through it with the reason for the SOEs not really being reformed of things is that they've managed to keep a pretty tight lid on things so far, right? I mean, that's.
Yeah, I mean, they do have a strong control over what's going on there. I mean, it's weird when you go there, because China has, when you spend time in China, it has this impression of being complete and utter chaos most of the time. But when you get into the things that the government actually strongly cares about, then they push a lot of resources towards dealing with that problem, and quickly.
I've noticed, I mean, and actually you see this, in most Chinese cities, the police presence actually feels rather light. I mean, they're always around. But for example, when you're around Tiananmen, there's like 3 layers of security to go through just to get into it. And it's pretty obvious that that's a pretty sensitive place for them. And the inner ring is pretty militarized. I mean, they look tough. They don't look like the kind of guys you want to mess around with. So
in the book, I've got a chapter on Wenzhou, which is a city in China that has no laws. It's a weird place, because what it was it's about it's right across the strait from Taiwan, and so during the 70s they removed all the industrial capacity out of there, and so when the 80s came along and people were reforming and doing private enterprise, the government said, okay, you do this, you do that, and Wenzhou, do whatever you think, whatever works for you, go ahead and do it. And so it was the first place to start a private enterprise. And to this day, most of their infrastructure was built by private businessmen. They have a private financial system which is monitored by the Chinese government. It's like they monitor interest rates in the completely illegal private financial system. And it's a fascinating story about when the Chinese government doesn't care, all sorts of interesting things happen. But there are certain things that they care very much about, and there's certain things where they go, oh, let's just let it go and see what happens.
well, and in fact, isn't that kind of a policy of the Chinese government to try to test out, take a province, take a city, try an experiment, see how it works? So.
Yeah, it's like pragmatically decentralized in that way. They kind of see what happens in various places, and when something works, they're like, oh, let's try it nationally.
What are the most precarious points in the Chinese economy?
Financial system. So, I mean, there's a few things. One is the government has been using our local governments. So the number that's generally thrown around is local governments have about 75% of expenditures with 50% of incomes, which doesn't make sense unless you see that they take money both from rural land, taking rural land from people, and the other thing they do is they create state-owned enterprises solely for the purpose of getting money from the financial system and then redirecting that money towards their preferred projects. This has led to strong kind of moral hazard in the financial system, and if it's not dealt with soon, they're going to have to do another bailout of the financial system, which the government has enough money to do right now, but it's probably not good for their long-term situation, and B, is just not a really good way to run a country. but it's this redirection of money from the financial system to the state-owned enterprises, which are doing things that kind of government pet projects. That's by far the biggest weakness that they have in their whole economy.
So it says land seizures, Skylar Rogers says, land seizures are an unsustainable way to make money. How should the government fix that, and what would the effect be? This is one of your conclusions, I think, actually.
So there's a few things that they're trying to do. They're trying to do like a local government bond system. But I think the big thing would be they moved a lot of social services to local governments, which they should probably renationalize. They need to move a lot of expenditures back to the central area, and then change kind of how they monitor what local governments do. Yeah, it at the end of the day comes down to tax reform and being less careless with their money, which is the extent to which the Chinese government is careless with their money gets surprising when you start looking into it.
Interesting. What are the negative aspects of migration for those who see an influx of new labor in the urban enclaves?
So the rural and urban labor markets are fairly separated, and so they tend to be. It tends to be, in terms of labor markets go, it tends to be complementary. Having more rural workers come in creates more opportunities for money to stay in the province, for people to make money off of higher land values for land speculation, for getting new and better jobs. What Chinese people tend to really complain about is access to education. Sometimes they complain about, like particularly young Chinese people complain about ability to pay for housing. It's a lot of the same things. I mean, one thing I was telling people earlier was down in Cupertino, right next to the Apple campus, there's a shopping mall there that's derelict. And it's right next to the Apple campus on some of the most valuable piece of property in the world. And they were going to do a redevelopment, and it didn't pass the city council because there would be more. It was a mixed-use development. There'd be more people moving in to live there. That would have to go to school prices, and they were concerned that it would put a strain on social services. And that's the exact same thing that Chinese people in the cities are worrying about. That these rural migrants put a strain on social services. They need to access our things, these things that were previously ours alone, and that the Chinese government, at the end of the day, doesn't have enough money to pay for both healthcare or social services or pensions for both rural migrants and urban migrants, or urban dwellers, which sometimes is a completely baseless belief. Shanghai seems to be dependent on rural migrants for their pension system, whereas most people living in Shanghai think the opposite. Sometimes it's, accurate. They don't have enough schools built for these rural migrants, and they need to invest more, which they're not willing to do.
Is there an issue of socialization when you get these people in off the land, basically trying to integrate them into the society? I mean, it sounds like there's probably a fair amount of resentment, especially with the perception that Shanghai, I recall that in the book. And you mentioned that people in Shanghai, really do need this influx to keep them kind of soluble. But do you find is there a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's a kind of hostility towards the migrants coming in?
Oh, definitely. And one of the stories I tell in the book is because a few years back, some people on like online forums in Hong Kong posted an advertisement in one of the local newspapers warning of an influx, an invasion of Chinese pregnant women. And it was these pregnant women coming from mainland China using Hong Kong hospitals, stealing all of their powdered milk, because this was right after the powdered milk scandal where some kids got poisoned, and how this was ruining Hong Kong, these Chinese people. And when Chinese web users picked up this advertisement and photoshopped it to say their own opinions, which, strangely enough, despite the fact that these Hong Kong people were talking about Chinese mainland people, these Chinese mainland people also had just horrible things to say about migrants. They're taking our places in schools. They're costing more for pensions, except for Shenzhen, which has grown from 300,000 people to 10 million people in the course of about 30 years. So everyone there is a migrant. And they're like, welcome everyone. We're all migrants here. Migrants are the reasons why we're all here today, why we've been able to build this great city, why we've been able to build these great companies. So I want you to all know you're welcome here. And I find it interesting both because there is this kind of resentment for not necessarily wrong reasons, but also because, you know, when you are in a situation where you can look closely on it, you can also see the benefits, and the people who were in the situation where they could look closely did see the benefits. Another anecdote was, and I believe it was Ai Weiwei who did this. Ai Weiwei, the Chinese dissident artist, he was invited to an art kind of biennial or something in Germany, and it was a small little town in Germany, and his art exhibit was he brought like a couple hundred migrant workers with him and just had them wander around the city. And it was just this impression of just like these people from nowhere just kind of wandering around your city, and he wanted to give the sense of kind of how that changes your perception of place.
It actually sounds like it mirrors this global phenomena of kind of a kind of sense of displacement between the urban and rural parts of the country. And it's interesting because I hadn't really thought about that in terms of China. I've obviously thought a lot about it in terms of the United States. So it's interesting, and maybe some of the same forces are at work there.
And one of the things that I kind of, in my last chapter, I try to draw larger points for the overall world at large. And one of the things that I thought was we can get from China is when we're talking about when we're talking about migration, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind, particularly these days, is immigration. But a lot of these soft barriers to migration, things like housing, things like access to schools, access to social services, that affects people within the country as much as it affects people outside the country. And if we care about things like immigration, we have these kind of low-hanging fruit that we can look at and say, like, fixing these problems can make things easier for both immigrants and for locals, and not necessarily that just making migration easier in general would be helpful to a lot of people. And there's been a lot of data coming out that's saying that migration, which America has traditionally been an extremely migrant country, we go to one place for university, another place for a job, another place for our retirement. That seems to be slowing down, and looking at kind of these soft barriers to migration as much as the hard barriers to migration, I think is one of the big messages of kind of China's Great Migration.
So Alan asked, what has been your general verdict on how the Chinese government has treated migrants with the constraints currently in place? And we talked a bit, I've been focused on the social side, but this is a question more about the government side. So how does the government, I mean, it's tried to ride the tiger, so to speak, but you know.
Poorly.
I hear that a lot.
So the Chinese government, I mean, one of the key stories from the book, and what I talked about earlier, was in 2003, the reason why they legalized people living away from their place of residence was because a migrant worker was beaten. No, he wasn't a migrant worker. He was a migrant. He was a university student who was migrating from one city to another to go to university, who was beaten to death in custody, which, I mean, it's always tricky talking about the Chinese government as a unified actor because those were police officers, and then Wenzhou came in and said, "This is horrible. We should." So I'm going to get rid of the. He made it so that the police can no longer arrest people for not having a proper residence permit. But to this day, migrants have less rights in cities. They have less access to social services in cities. I mean, in another book I'm reading right now, they bring up the point that one of the largest wealth transfers ever was when state-owned enterprises were made to sell off their real estate holdings, which they sold them off to. They gave their real estate holdings to basically the people who were living there, which were their employees, for discounted or nothing, and this led to a great increase in kind of wealth of people living in cities, but it led to people living in the countryside not having the same access to real estate or not having the same access to income because they still don't own their land. Their land is still kind of by the overall village, and it often is stolen from them. So, I mean, they have there's been efforts to, I mean, as time has moved on, they've given these rural workers more and more and more rights. Getting rid of the hukou system probably wouldn't be as hard as they think it would be. It probably wouldn't require as much money as they think it would be. It would require them changing how they distribute social services, which they're slowly and surely doing. But it's not on the top of their list to do partially because they have very big problems with their fiscal system, and partially because they say they don't want more than 20 million people in Shanghai and Beijing, which I don't know where they got that number from, but I'm making that number up, but they have a specific number of people that they want in Shanghai and Beijing, and I don't know why they don't want that more people there, but I assume it's just because it would get crowded.
I think it's already pretty crowded. So one last question. As Americans, what should we take away from this, and why should we care, basically?
So I wrote this I wanted to answer two questions. One was what migration says about China and what China says about migration. What migration says about China is, I mean, in both cases, is quite a lot. What migration says about China, it says a lot of kind of why China has been successful at alleviating poverty. It says a lot of kind of why China's political reforms have gone through. It also talks a lot about kind of what problems it will face in the future, how we should expect China to progress over the next 10, 20 years. If that's interesting to you, or I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to affect the entire world what happens in China. So it will show kind of where China's going and how big it's going to eventually get. If that's interesting to you, that's a great entry point to the book. It also talks about kind of what China can tell us about migration. And this has become, surprisingly, because I didn't know this when I wrote the book, that this would become a big topic in the media. One thing that it showed is when we talk about labor markets, we tend to talk about supply and demand of labor. One thing that's been very clear in the Great Migration is that the division of labor matters way more for wages. And a lot of businesses started that just simply wouldn't be there if we didn't have a lot of migrants. Second thing it showed is, as much as, on the other side of that, is that there's a very real stress on asset values, there's a very, very real stress on real estate, and there's a very real stress on social services, that if we want to be friendly to migrants in whatever country we're in, it's worth looking at to see kind of how we can reform it to make it more responsive and more ready for migrants.
Interesting. Well, on behalf of the World Affairs, I'd like to thank Bradley. His book, China's Great Migration, is going to be for sale. And it's a great book. I actually quite enjoyed reading it. And thank you, Bradley, for your time tonight.
Thank you.